You should be getting pretty comfy in Illustrator by now. You've been using shapes, the pen tool, different stroke options, and even the Pathfinder. Let's hop back into Illustrator to explore these tools a bit deeper. You probably discovered that this assignment was a little bit trickier than you expected, but that was by design. I wanted to be able to show you how you can take these things that look pretty tough and recreate them fairly smoothly. So let's take a look at a couple of these eyedropper industry logos just to kind of get a sense for how different a traced logo can look based on who's making it. So here's one example, looks pretty accurate. We've got a second one that is clearly different if I turn it off and back on. Even some different colors here. Got a third one that's still a little bit different. Strokes are a little bit thinner there. And then we've got another one. The parachute is pretty much a completely different shape up at the top. You can see how much that changes. And then we have one more down here, and even just another arrangement. All the text seems to be changing between these 5 examples. One of them even has a different version of this font. You see, this is straight-edged version compared to the round version. So little details like that are very important. When you know the font of the brand, you need to make sure that you're using the correct version. This is Trump Gothic Pro, but we needed to use, if I can find it, Trump Soft Pro, and then the bold italic version. So that was the issue. It's very similar, but it's something that a brand would notice. Now, one reason why this particular logo was probably more difficult than you expected was because it's made up of very simple shapes. It looks very simple, but it was put at an angle, and that made it pretty difficult to try and recreate perfectly. So what I'm going to do really quickly is just show you how I would recreate it from scratch and show you a couple of tricks along the way. So here we have the original logo, that really tiny resolution logo. First thing I want to do is make it bigger and make it 800 pixels wide. You never want to work at such a tiny scale with your vectors. Just give yourself more space to work around in, and even this is a little bit small, so I think I'll bump this up to 1,000 pixels. And now I want to think about how I would go about recreating this. And it's not just grabbing my pen tool and starting to trace. First thing I want to do is make this perfectly vertical, because at this angle it'd be much harder to get all of these shapes to line up accurately. When in reality this logo was probably created straight up and then slanted, rotated to the side to match the angle of the text. So I don't want to recreate something that was probably created straight up and down. You know, this line right here is probably perfectly aligned with this top part of the box, and then that probably lines up perfectly with where all the strings on the parachutes are coming down, and then that lines up perfectly in the middle here and the middle here. So I should have a straight line going through that entire object and have everything line up to it perfectly. So I first want to rotate it counterclockwise so that it's straight up and down again. But how can I do that accurately? Well, I'm going to do this using guides and the rotate tool, and I'll show you how I do it. First, I'll press Command R to bring up my rulers, grab a ruler by clicking on, or a guide by clicking on the ruler and dragging it out, and I'm going to line it up with my best guess as to where the center of that bottom middle section of the box is, right where these paths all intersect. So right about there, and I'll let go. So now I've got my guide, and if you drag a guide out and it doesn't appear, just make sure you have View, Guides, and Show Guides is what's visible right here. All right, so I've got that in place. Next, I want to select the image, zoom in a little bit, nice and close here, press R to get to my rotate tool, and then click right at that intersection one more time. My best guess as to where that point is. That'll put my rotation point, the pivot point, right on that spot. Then, what I could do is just click and drag a little bit, trying to get it to line up as best as I can, or I could grab with my mouse right where I think the center of the top of that parachute is. So right about there looks like the middle point. I could click and drag from that point, and then because my smart guides are on, Command U is the shortcut, it's going to snap to that guide, and it's going to rotate perfectly 10.1 degrees. So my best guess is that this was rotated 10 degrees, but I'm going to just leave it at 10.1, let go of my mouse, and see if that lined up. Okay, so it does look like it was a little bit off. So I'm just going to click and drag a little bit more until that lines up perfectly. Somewhere right about there. Now I say perfectly, I just mean as best as I can with this horribly low resolution image. But if you take this line from the bottom of the box and you look at it going all the way up this line through both sections of the box, through the intersection of all these strings, the middle of this part of the parachute, and the middle of the top of the parachute, that's pretty accurate. Now that it's been rotated, with it selected, I can go to my Properties panel and look at exactly how much I rotated it, which is 9.26 degrees. This is an important number because I'm going to need to rotate everything back after I've recreated it. Now, I could always just click on this image after I've recreated the logo, look at that number, and then rotate it in the opposite direction, that amount. But just to be on the safe side, just in case for whatever reason this number goes away, I'm going to just copy it and then add a little note with the text tool right here. I'm going to say 9.26 degrees, and that way I'm not going to forget about it. I'll lock that. Command 2 is the keyboard shortcut to lock an object, by the way. But that way I know that I need to rotate everything back 9.26 degrees after I've recreated it. All right, now that it's done, let's just start with the box. This should be very simple because all of these lines are parallel to each other. And I want that because that's going to make a nice clean logo, and I can pretty much bet that's how this box was created originally. And then I'm going to start in the top left corner as best as I can, click and drag, and then I'm not going to go down to the bottom right corner. I'm going to try and line it up with the bottom left corner and then pull it out to the middle. And the reason I'm doing that is because now that it's drawn, I can switch to my direct selection tool, grab this line segment, which, let me lock this layer real quick. There we go. Grab this segment of the line, click and drag between those 2 points, and it's going to move both of them at once while holding shift so it only moves vertically, and then move it down as far as it needs to be. And that way, those two top and bottom segments are going to be perfectly parallel. Now that I have that, I can just copy it, paste in front, or paste in place, either one. I think the shortcut for paste in front is quicker. It's Command F instead of Command Shift V for paste in place. So Command F to paste in front. I'll press O for my reflect tool. I'll click on this anchor point because it's going to flip around the center point there. Click, hold Shift while dragging to flip that over, reflect it over to the other side, and I've got the bottom portion of my box recreated. Next, I'm going to basically do the same thing, but I'm going to start with a copy of this object. So I'm just going to hold Option, click and drag up until that lines up with about the top of the box. I'll grab the lower segment, hold Shift, drag that up, and then I want to scale it up proportionally so that these two lines stay at the exact same angle as the lines down here. If I were to just scale it out like this, then that angle is changing, that slant is changing, and it's not in sync with the bottom part of the box anymore. So I'm going to just shift click and drag this top left corner until it's about the right width, and then I'll grab this line segment one more time while holding shift and bring it down. That looks pretty close. I'll copy that, paste in front, Command F, O to reflect, click on that point, flip with shift, there we go. And now all that's left with the box is the top, so I'm going to base that off of this shape one more time because my angles are correct. I'm going to press Command C to copy, Command F to paste in front. Then I'll grab this line segment right here and drag it over until I can hopefully line this up perfectly. So what I'm trying to do is move this anchor point here perfectly aligned with that point while keeping this moving with it. So I think what I need to do is select both anchor points, and then click and drag on this one. There we go. The white arrow means that it's lined up perfectly on that point, and everything should be 100% perfectly aligned now. Now I can add my colors. So I'm going to switch to my eyedropper, eye on the keyboard, shift click on this color, switch to my stroke by pressing X, shift click on the red color, the darkest part that I can find, and I'll make the stroke bigger. And to me, it looks like all the strokes are rounded. It doesn't look like anything's pointy, and that goes along with the font as well. The font is soft instead of the regular version, so I'm going to change the stroke to be round caps and corners. And then I'll do the same thing for the other side. Shift click for the fill color, then I will grab the same stroke color and make sure it's the same size, 6 points and rounded. Now that I have those, I can just sample the entire appearance of each of these shapes, and the box top looks like it's the same color as this, so I'm just going to do that. And there we go, we've got the box created. All right, next up is the parachute. Let's start with the upper half and then do the lines, because I think I want the lines to be based on where these intersections are and not the other way around. Another strategy to look for when you're trying to recreate something that is not very high quality is looking for simple shapes. The bottom half was a bunch of boxes and they were all very symmetrical. The top half, the parachute at least, looks like it's based on a perfect circle. That happens a lot in logos. So let's see if we can start there. I'm going to grab my ellipse tool, turn off the fill for now, and then just make a perfect circle while clicking and dragging and holding shift. I'll reposition this with the space bar, try and make that as nice and perfect as I can. I think that looks pretty good. I'm looking at this point here, and this point up at the top. Now I want to make sure that it's perfectly aligned to the center of everything else. Remember that I'm trying to keep this all perfectly aligned, so I'm going to shift click on this box right here, and then click once more to make that the key object. And then I'll align to the center, and that shifted over the circle just a little bit so it lines up with the top of that box. And by the way, if you're ever trying to line something up and Illustrator is giving you a hard time, if you ever notice that you can't line 2 points up perfectly or an object isn't moving exactly where you want it, it's probably this button right here, which is Align Art to Pixel Grid. Make sure that's unchecked if you need to be really, really precise with where you're putting your vectors. That can also be found on the Properties panel. When you have your artboard selected, you can turn snap options for the pixel grid off. But that is something that can trip you up if you're not aware of it. All right, now that I got this circle here, I don't need the bottom portion, so I'm going to select it with my direct selection, delete, and I'm just left with the top half of that circle. The next shape I'm looking at are these little arches right here, which to me also look like they're based on perfect circles. So I'm going to again switch to my ellipse tool, L on the keyboard, and make a circle that fits that shape. So right about there looks pretty good to me. And I'm betting, this is again just an educated guess, that these 3 arches are going to be the same size, so I can use the same circle to base each shape off of. So I'm just going to Option drag this one over. And again, this one's I want this to be perfectly aligned to the center, so I'll shift click on this box, click once more to make it the key object, and then align it to the center. And then to make sure this one is perfectly offset in the mirrored direction, I'm going to reflect this one based on the center. So I'm going to copy, paste in front, reflect based on the top anchor point, which I know is in the middle, click, hold shift, and then rotate so that it mirrors it over there perfectly. So there we go. I'm going to switch to my outline mode, Command Y on the keyboard, and these are the paths that I'm concerned with, these overlapping paths. And to get this shape working, I don't even have to do anything destructive. I'm first just going to join this path, Command J, then I'll select all of them, and I'm going to hold down Option and click on the minus front, and that will make a compound shape based on all of those paths. And if I move this over, you can see that's giving me the exact shape that I needed. All right, I'll undo that, and what I need to do now is just make these 2 lines. And I could do this with the pen tool, or I could go into this compound shape, copy this path, double click to get out of it, Command F to paste in front, and then just scale it down. Hold down Option to scale it in perfectly, and there we go. What I'm looking for is this intersection right here. I'm going to switch to my outline again. I want this path to line up right where those points match up. So first I'll just get rid of this part of the path so it's an open path one more time. Then I'll switch to my outline mode and be very precise about this by making sure I have the entire path selected. I'll press S to get to my scale tool, which because I haven't clicked anywhere, it's going to scale it from the perfect center of this object of my selection. Then I'll grab the path about where I think I need it, click and drag inwards until it locks right there, and that way I know it's perfectly aligned to the intersection. And then I just want to check the top point to see if it lines up. Now, it doesn't right now, and this line right here, if I zoom out, is actually the guide. That guide is pretty much irrelevant at this point because I'm aligning everything to the objects and not the actual guide. So I'm just going to turn that off by pressing Command:. Then I'll zoom back in here, and what I'm really concerned with is that this point on the inside arch is perfectly aligned with this point on the outside arch. So I'm just going to grab this point and move it straight up until it lines up perfectly there. And now the basic components of my umbrella should be completely set up. With that done, I can switch to my pen tool, find that intersection point, right there, add an anchor, and do the same thing on this side. And I know this is the intersection because it says intersect there, my smart guides. There we go. I'll get rid of these 2 points, and I'm left with just the paths that I need. All right, now that I know that's all set up perfectly, I'm going to expand this shape so I'm left with just that. I'm going to fill this object with the same appearance as what's down here, and I need to fill this with the red color that was underneath it. So I'm just going to cut, Command X, just temporarily, fill this with this color right here, make the stroke 6 points, and round it off. And then paste behind, which is Command B, that pastes behind your selection, and it's almost working. What we're missing is this bottom arch right here. So I'm going to switch to my outline mode, copy this path by selecting that anchor point, saying copy, Command C. Then I'm going to isolate this object by double-clicking on it. That way I can't edit anything else but that selection. I'll press Command F to paste in front, and then I want to join these paths. So I'm going to select these 2 anchor points. They're in the exact same position already, so all I have to do is press Command J. Then I'll do the same thing on this side, Command J. Double click to get out of that isolation mode, and that shape is perfect now. All that's missing is the color. So I need to, once again, I'll get rid of this fill, cut this object, eyedropper, shift click on that red, and then paste behind. There we go. I've got the perfect umbrella. Now that that's laid out, I know exactly where all of these points need to go. So I'll start right here, click on that anchor point, go down to here, and my smart guides are telling me, yes, that's exactly where it needs to be. Now I can tell this is not aligned perfectly to the center of this line, but what's important is that I match the angle. Then I can make some adjustments. But I'm going to try and align that angle exactly the same and click once. Then I'll come up and finish off the path by clicking there, get rid of this fill, and then I'll do the same thing right here. I'm going to get to my pen tool, click once here, go down to this anchor point, click once here, and I have my lines. I'll make sure they're all the right weight. Looks like they are. I've got all the shapes that I need. And from here I could make some more adjustments, like pulling all of these down just a little bit if I wanted to, but I think this is going to be close enough. Now that this is built up, I can just go to my layers, make sure that that object is unlocked, the logo behind it. I'll select everything and rotate it negative 9.26 degrees. Because I have everything selected and not just the image, that's why that rotation isn't showing up anymore. So I'm just going to type in negative 9.26 and press enter. Now I know it's perfectly rotated, and I can type out my text, which is eyedropper industries. And I know I need that to be the same dark red color as these lines. Shift click on that, line it up, and get that fitting just perfect right about there. I think that's going to do it. Let me get this logo out of the way. We can compare them side by side. We have a nice clean logo. It looks like some of my strokes are a little bit different widths. The parachute looks thinner than the lines to me, and the box looks thinner as well. So I'm just going to select those, select the top part, go to the stroke, and then just turn that down 1 or 2 points. That looks a little bit more accurate to me. And that thickness difference between those 2 different lines, I'm betting is an aliasing issue, just something with this low resolution image. I would seriously doubt that the designer, the original designer, would have made these lines thicker than everything else. So I'm actually just going to grab those and I'm going to bump them down as well. I think that looks more uniform, and if the client has an issue with it, they can let me know. But just based on my own experience as a designer and seeing these types of logos, I'm going to go ahead and make an educated guess that those stroke widths need to be uniform. All right, now that that's done, I'm going to go into my layers, unlock this text and get rid of it, and I can hide that reference layer. But there we go. We've got the recreated Eyedropper Industries logo. All right, now really quickly, I just want to take a look at the Pathfinder and Bezier Bakery logos. So here are some examples of some recreations of this logo. Again, a lot of variation when multiple people are trying to trace the original logo. So one very common issue that I saw was that these marks right here, students have a hard time identifying what they actually are. If we take a look at the real logo, the reference logo, it is very hard to identify what shape that is. And because of these darker pixels right here, sometimes students will assume that's supposed to be a rotated angle. But I want to show you something. If that's the case, I'm just going to copy this path over here and bring it over right here. And I'm going to zoom in nice and close. It's really hard to know what a vector path is going to look like once it's rasterized, unless you use the pixel preview inside of Illustrator. So I'm going to scale this down really, really far until it's about the same size as what we see in this reference image. So about that small. Make sure it's on the right layer here. All right, so about that small. Then I'm going to go to View, Pixel Preview. And you'll notice something. Even though I'm looking at a raster version of this shape, it basically looks exactly the same. I'm switching between this by pressing Command-Option-Y. That switches between the pixel preview and the GPU preview through Illustrator. You'll notice it's exactly the same because they're just squares. It's just a couple of squares lined up next to each other just like pixels would be. So if you're in doubt about what this shape might look at it at the same scale, recreated the way that you think it should be in a pixel preview. And if it's not looking the same, that's a pretty good indicator that you're probably a little bit off. What's more likely is that this is just a really small circle. If I draw a circle about that size, and I say about because this is really rough, and then I move it over right about here, you see that shape looks a whole lot more like the one in the reference image. It's got kind of this darker area here and some aliased pixels around the outside. So like I said, that's a pretty good indicator that this is actually a circle and not some other shape like an arrow. And this is just something that comes with experience. This is not at all something that I would have expected you to know how to approach or how to troubleshoot. But now you can see how to look at certain elements to kind of gauge what the objects might have been, even if they're really tiny details in a horribly low resolution image. All right, and then finally we have the Bezier Bakery. So here are some examples of this logo being recreated. Again, every designer has a different take on this low resolution image. The first thing I want to point out is the shape of the pen, the tip. There's very clearly a curve on this point here. It's like a quill tip pen. And each designer had their own take on how that should look. On this one, we can see that there is no curve. So that's an important detail that I think is visible enough in this logo. So make sure that you're seeing those little details. But then we have, another one. This one I think was done very well on the pen tip. This one is slightly more rounded, which from this reference image, it's very difficult to tell whether or not it should be rounded or not. But I think the client may want to take another pass at that once they see it recreated. And especially this one, because it looks like it curves out a little bit, and I don't think that's something that would be reflected in their original logo. I can see where that designer was pulling from. It kind of does look like it's curving out a bit. But out of all of these examples, I think this one right here is probably the most accurate representation of that portion. Now, one very common issue with this logo rebuild is the students using the pen tool for more than they need to. And I'll point something out here. This curve right here and here is definitely recreated with the pen tool. If we take a look at the other examples, same thing. You can just tell this is a pen tool path because this part is a different shape than down here. Everything is kind of free-handed. And that's pretty much the case with all of these examples. But just like with the parachute on the eyedropper logo, look for ways that you can find perfect shapes inside of logos. In this case, circles, because again, circles and squares and parallel lines and perpendicular lines show up a lot inside of logos, and they can make your life a lot easier when trying to recreate something like this. So let's just focus on this bottom layer of the cupcake first. I'm going to lock this, first I'm going to scale this up. We don't want to work this small. So I'll make it 1000 pixels wide, and then I'll lock it. And then I'm going to grab my ellipse tool again, switch to be a stroke instead of a fill, and just make it, let's just make it bright yellow for now. All right, so first of all, this looks like a perfect circle to me. You see how that lines up pretty much identically? There we go. All right, then I'm going to duplicate that over, and I think I'm going to do the far left one next. Scale this down until that aligns a lot better. Okay, and then I'm going to duplicate this one over here. And then I'm going to repeat that transformation. This is a new keyboard shortcut. It's Command D. And what that does is repeats whatever you did last. So I could duplicate this over here, press Command D, it'll duplicate it again, and I can keep pressing Command D as much as I want, and it'll repeat that transformation over and over again. Now that time it didn't actually look like it moved it how far I needed it to, but I was just trying to see if those three objects were perfectly spaced out. So I'm just going to align that where I think it needs to be, get that nice and centered up. Now that those three objects are where I need them and I can see clearly that those shapes were made up of circles, I'm going to make them a compound shape. Hold down Option, Unite, and now they're all one shape. I can fill it with this color right here and then add a nice fat stroke. Shift click on this dark stroke and make it much thicker. And again, all of these strokes look rounded, so I'm going to round them off, caps and corner. I'll make this a little bit thicker, maybe around 10. I'm not exactly sure how thick I need to make that yet, but that looks pretty good. But that's going to be the start of my cupcake, and because it's a compound shape, I can always make adjustments. Then I would go on to the next layer, which is this frosting, and that looks like I should probably freehand it. Those aren't necessarily perfect circles, so that actually makes sense because frosting wouldn't necessarily be so perfect. But then I could come up to the next layer. It looks to me like this second layer of frosting is also made up of perfect circles, so I'm going to move this one right about there, and then I'm going to duplicate it by dragging while holding Option. Maybe make that one a little bit bigger. And then I just need to simply connect these two together with the pen tool. So probably start right about here with the anchor point and then go right here and then just line that up until it fits. Now I'm not going to spend all the time it takes to recreate this logo, but this is how I would approach it. Something like that. And then the bottom half doesn't really matter because it's going to go below the frosting below it. But something like this. Grab those two objects, join them together, and then I can create another compound path between those objects, and I've got my second shape. So there we go. And again, this is going to be layered, so I'm going to want to move this one below the other object. Command left bracket moves an object one step below in the layers palette. If you look at the layers, with that object selected, I can move it up or down using the left and right arrow, left and right brackets while holding down Command. So that would go below it. We'd have another layer of this frosting on top of it, and then again another layer right on top, which looks to me like another perfect circle right about there. And then this one's probably going to be free-handed. So pen tool, maybe starting here, coming up here, and then rounding this all off nicely. Again, the bottom portion doesn't matter because it's going behind the other object. Make these a compound path. And there we go. So I'd bring these over again, move this one back, and there we go. Obviously, it needs a little bit more work. That's not a perfect representation. I'm going very fast, but I just want to show you that you don't have to use the pen tool for everything. And in most cases, you're not necessarily going to want to use the pen tool because it shows. It's basically impossible to make a perfect circle by hand using the pen tool. So don't even try. There's no reason to when you have the ellipse tool available. One last little detail on this particular logo that a lot of people miss is this little accent mark above the E in Bezier. So that's an important thing, and if you don't know how to get that type of an accent mark inside of your type, then this is how you do it. I want to show you. First, just select the E, and it's going to give you alternate versions right down here, but these are just alternate versions of the exact same character. So if I were to click on this, the difference you see is that it's disconnecting that E. So whoever designed this font actually designed an E that can be connected to the next letter or at the end of a word without a tail. So a more appropriate use for that would have been probably the E in the. So if I grab that, I could take off that little tail. That wasn't something that was reflected in the source logo though, so I don't need to change that. But let's say that I need to add that accent mark. Well, I'm going to select that E, come up to Type, and down to Glyphs. Glyph is a typography term used to describe basically any character in a font. So if I move this over here, I can click on any one of these double click on it, and it's going to replace what I have selected. So I am looking for this E right here with the accent mark. But if you look nice and close, let me zoom in here, you can see that doesn't have the little tail that connects to the next letter like I need it. So I need to keep looking and find right there. That is the E I need. I'm going to double click. There we go. I've got the proper E there with the accent mark, and my recreated logo is good to go. So there are some tips on recreating logos with very small resolution. Remember to think about things like those perfect objects that you can find within a logo, like circles or squares, parallel lines, perpendicular lines. Those show up all the time. And when you can't use those perfect shapes, try to start with a perfect shape and then modify it. Use the pen tool when you're recreating something like a logo, I'd say as sparingly as possible. If it can be recreated with basic geometric shapes, then it should be, because that will keep the number of points down and the paths much cleaner. It's only week 2 and you're already jumping between Illustrator and Photoshop. Pretty crazy, huh? Your first Photoshop exercise had you build a one-frame ad for shaving cream and forced you not only to use Photoshop tools, but to think about design. Let's take a look at some of the work.